All right, so we have success with our sourdough starter. So this is ready to bake with. Hey everyone, welcome. My name is Allie, and today I'm going to teach you how to make a sourdough starter from scratch. So sourdough is becoming more and more popular, and I love that. Sourdough is really fun. There's a lot of health benefits to eating sourdough. I know that sourdough can seem overwhelming and daunting when you're just starting out. I know that I felt the exact same way, but my goal with this video is to hopefully show you that sourdough is actually very achievable. I am actually going to be making a sourdough starter right along with you, and I'm going to be showing you the progress every single day so that you have something visually to compare your starter to. All right, so we are gonna go ahead and get started. I'm gonna first share with you the supplies that you will need. So the first thing you'll need is 2 glass jars, and they can be any kind of glass jars. You do not have to get fancy with this. You'll want to use a glass jar and not anything like metal or plastic, in my opinion, because metal can kind of like counteract with the sourdough and cause it not to work. I have these really cute jars. They are Weck jars, and I will have these linked down below. I think they are so cute sitting on my counter, but you don't have to use these. I do recommend using a glass jar that has straight sides. These don't have straight sides, but I'll link the ones that do. Because as your starter starts to rise, you want to be able to see when it has reached its peak or when it has doubled or tripled in size. And so if it has straight sides, that just makes it a lot easier to tell. You also want to make sure that your jar has a lid, but make sure that the lid does not seal. The next thing you'll need is a food scale. Now, you don't have to use a food scale. You could use measuring cups, but the reason I like a food scale is because it is very precise and consistent. You're also gonna need something to stir your sourdough starter with. All right, so let's talk water really quick. You're gonna wanna use filtered water. Don't use distilled water, and don't use tap water. Tap water has chlorine in it, and the chlorine will definitely kill off the wild yeast and the good bacteria that we are trying to cultivate in our sourdough starter. Flour is very important. I personally use unbleached all-purpose flour. The King Arthur brand is my personal favorite. The main thing you want to make sure of is not to use bleached. You also can use whole wheat or gluten-free flour. However, those last two require a different process to creating your sourdough starter. So don't follow this tutorial and try and use those 2 flours because you will not get the right results. All right, now we are going to get into making the sourdough starter. This process will take between 7 to 10 days to create a sourdough starter. So this is day 1. So first get your glass jar and get your scale, turn it on, make sure it says 0, and we're measuring in grams. So 0 grams. Get your water, and you're gonna add 50 grams of water. And then you're gonna add 50 grams of flour. So I like to zero out my scale so it says 0 grams again, and then do 50 grams of flour. If you are using measuring cups, you're gonna do 1/4 a cup of water and 1/3 a cup of flour. All you do now is just stir the flour and the water together, and you will notice that it is on the thicker side, which is totally normal and actually exactly what you want. So this is the consistency that you want and that you are looking for. It's like a very thick pancake batter. The reason that you want to keep your sourdough starter nice and thick is because the flour is what the starter is feeding off of. Flour is basically like food for the starter. So if you're not feeding your starter enough flour, then the starter is going to get hungry quicker, and that is where you run into issues. So then just put the lid on your starter, and you are gonna set it on the counter for 24 hours. And after 24 hours, then we're gonna do day 2 of our sourdough starter process. So this is day 2 with our sourdough starter. This is the least exciting day because we are not going to do a single thing to it. We are going to let it sit for another 24 hours. So on day 2, we actually have quite a bit of action going on. I see a lot of bubbles it has kind of risen in some spots. It has not risen as much as it is going to by any means, but it's kind of got like these craters going on. So on day 2 and in the coming days, you will probably notice that it doesn't smell super good. Some say it smells like stinky socks. Today we're not going to do anything at all. Just put the lid back on and you're going to let it sit for another 24 hours. Now I do want to note something that I do to help me keep track of what day we are on. So I just put a little piece of paper. You can do a sticky note. I wrote day 1 yesterday, and I also wrote the time of day that I fed my starter. This just helps me remember. Otherwise I will lose track of what day we're on or what time I should feed it. We are on day 3 now, and today we are going to feed our starter. So this is what our starter looks like. There are a lot of little tiny bubbles. It has not risen at all though, and you will probably definitely notice the smell. It is very unpleasant, that stinky sock smell. I do want you to pay attention and look for mold at this point. Mold is something that should not happen, but it can happen, and there's a couple of reasons that it could happen. The first is if you are using a jar or a container that is not completely clean, if there's any food particles or anything in the jar, that can cause mold. If something falls into the jar, maybe a piece of food or a bug or something, that also can cause mold. If you see that, then you need to completely throw your starter out and start over, unfortunately. Our starters are still really young. They are not resilient to things like bad bacteria and mold, so we just need to keep an eye on it. So now we are going to feed our starter. I have my food scale and I have a clean jar. I always recommend feeding into a clean jar, and that just goes back to the whole mold issue. Now if you're confused at this point, remember I will have all of the instructions very simply typed out for you to easily follow. I'm going to take half of the starter out of this jar and pour it into my clean jar. Now, I like to be super precise, so I'm going to measure out 40 grams. That is about half of my starter. So always start by zeroing out your scale and then pour 40 grams of starter in. And now I'm going to zero out my scale again and add 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. So I like to start with my water. 50 grams, zero out my scale, add 50 grams of flour, and then stir it all together. So now I'm going to place the lid on my starter, and I also have my little tag that says we are on day 3 and that I fed it around 3 p.m. And so I'm going to stick that on the top, and I'm just gonna let this sit for another 24 hours. All right, so we are on day 4 with our sourdough starter, and I am seeing something that I don't love today. And that's why I love showing you how to make a sourdough starter while I'm also making one, because then I can show you the issues that I'm running into and how I troubleshoot them. This is the difference between just giving you a recipe and saying, if you follow these steps exactly, you will have a successful sourdough starter. Because everybody's sourdough starters and their environment is different and different problems will arise. So today I have this dark liquid on top of my starter that is called hooch. It's basically just alcohol on top. It's okay because we're gonna fix it. If you see hooch, that just means that your starter is hungry. And last time I shared making a sourdough starter, it was in the middle of winter, and the recipe that I used then was fine for cooler temperatures, but I'm gonna have to tweak it and adjust my starter because now it is summertime and the weather is warmer and it just affects my starter differently. So today we're gonna feed our starter again. We're gonna follow the exact same steps that I did yesterday. 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water, but instead of taking 40 grams of starter out and adding that to my new flour and water in my clean jar, I am going to instead take out 20 grams. And now that still might be too much, but I'm going to just try it. And then if I find that there's still hooch on top, then I will go even less and maybe do 10. You don't have to pour off that dark liquid, just stir it back in. Never throw your starter out unless you see mold. If you see hooch or things are just not progressing the way you want, never throw your starter out. It's always redeemable. So I'm gonna feed my starter now, and then I'm gonna let it sit on the counter for another 24 hours. So we are on day 5 with our sourdough starter, and things are looking a lot better than they were yesterday. There's still a little bit of hooch on top, but not nearly as much as there was. My starter still smells a little bit stinky, but again, much better than it has been. And there's a few bubbles, but really there's not a whole lot of action going on. So today, again, I'm going to continue feeding my starter the way I have. I'm going to take 20 grams of starter out of this jar and put it into a clean jar with 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. Let my starter sit on the counter for another 24 hours. All right, so we have success with our sourdough starter. So this is ready to bake with. In the past, it has taken me 7 days to make a starter, but I also made my starter in the winter time. This time I made it in the summer, and I actually had to tweak my process to get it to work. So here are some tips if you are doing it in the warmer months versus the cooler months. In the cooler months, you are only going to feed your starter every 24 hours, and eventually it should start to double in size. You may actually have to stick your starter into the oven and just turn the light on and only leave it in there for like an hour or maybe 2, because it can get too warm in the oven. Then take it out of the oven, and I wrapped it in a towel and set it underneath my microwave light. And then on day 7, I woke up to a nice bubbly starter. That was in the winter. If you are going to make a starter in the warmer months, this is the process I would use. I would feed every 24 hours up until day 6. On day 6, I would start feeding every 12 hours, so feed it once in the morning, once in the afternoon, and I would only do 10 grams of starter to 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water for each of those feedings. And you should see success with your starter after maybe a day or so. Once your starter is established, you are going to feed it every 24 hours. And you're going to feed it 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water, and 10 grams of starter. How do you know when your starter is ready for baking? This starter right here is ideal for baking. It has more than doubled in size, and it has reached its peak. Now you want to use your starter when it's at its peak, not when it is starting to fall back down. Otherwise, it won't make your bread rise. A test that I like to do is called the float test. Get some water, and then you pour your starter into the water. If it floats, that means it is active and it should make your bread rise. I bake with my starter all of the time, so I just keep it on my counter and I feed it every 24 hours. That ensures that my starter is as active as it can be and it's going to be as powerful as I want it for whatever I'm baking. Now, if you don't plan on using your starter very often, maybe only once a week, you can actually keep your starter in the refrigerator. That way you don't have to feed it all the time. So what I usually do is I will feed my starter, let it sit on the counter for an hour or so, and then I will just stick it in the fridge. Make sure you put a lid on that seals. And then when you're ready to use it, you'll actually need to think ahead a little bit, take it out of the refrigerator. I feed mine right away. You're gonna wanna feed it 2 times before you are ready to use your starter. I hope that this video was helpful for you and explained the process in a simple way. I know it sounds like a lot of information, but I promise if you follow my instructions, you should see success with your starter. I will have all of the instructions written out in a nice, simple format for you visual people who need to see it quickly. You can reference back to that as well. Happy baking, happy sourdough making. If you make a starter, share it over on Instagram in your stories and tag me so that I can see it. If you need help troubleshooting, I can help over there with some troubleshooting. But have fun with this. Enjoy the process. Enjoy slowing down with your food, making things with your hands. It is so much fun, and I know you're gonna have a blast. All right, I love y'all, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.